I should start with an apology. Since Jerry asked us to talk about delivery, we felt we had to find out something about what Welsh policy was, as Chris said a minute or two ago. I'm always hesitant coming into a foreign country from a knowledge base of zero, having acquired, after much hard work I should say, a knowledge base of about 10% and making recommendations. I take comfort, however, from an encounter I had many years ago with the great Paul Krugman. We happened both to be guest speakers at the annual conference of the Swedish White Collar Trade Union. And so we were in Gothenburg, and so we're staying in the same hotel, and over a drink we were talking about his travels, and he said, well, he didn't know Sweden very well, but he was going, didn't know it all, never been there before, he was going off to Stockholm. And then we talked about international advice given by economists. And he said very forcibly how he despised the have model will travel economists. The economists who, for a pretty penny, will take their laptop, go to a country they've never been to before, knowing nothing about its culture, its history, its economic institutions, or any other institutions, and giving advice to the government. And I agreed with him and went to bed. The following morning I woke up and turned the TV on, and it happened to be overnight when the Swedish currency collapsed and short-term interest rates hit the stratosphere. So there was panic, and there was an English channel, fortunately. My Swedish wasn't very good, and it was very interesting. And then suddenly, Paul Krugman appears on the scene telling the Swedes exactly what to do. So at least I hope I'm not as bad as that. Essentially where we've got to is, if we want an education and training system, be it the full-time the education system itself or work-based training, to serve well the needs of the people being educated and trained, and at the same time to serve the needs of the economy, we need matching. That's the point about demand. And some countries have found that difficult enough, even in the short term, but at least we can improve that by better forecasting techniques. The Dutch have a superb system there. It gets harder and harder the further ahead you go in time, but one still has to bear this in mind. And this is where the employers, it seems to me, should come in. Looking at the Welsh strategy, this is what I got out of the current industrial strategies. This is their own money, not what they might get from the general UK industrial strategy. There's an economic contract, as I understand it, and any firm wanting to get DOSH from the Welsh government has to subscribe to 4 requirements of the economic contract: growth potential, fair work, promotion of health, skills and learning in the workplace, and reducing the carbon footprints. Has to believe in all of that and demonstrate it. If it gets through that stage, then it has to show that it can deliver against one of 5 calls to action. They are decarbonisation, innovation, entrepreneurship and having headquarters, exports and trade, high quality employment and fair work, R&D, automation and digitalisation. If they get through that stage, as I understand it, then an application can go in for the DOSH to the government. That seems all perfectly reasonable, but I can still, having studied other industrial policies a hell of a lot, believe it doesn't necessarily lead to brilliant decisions as to which enterprises should be subsidized and supported and which shouldn't. There are a lot of other decisions to be taken. Not my place to judge whether those decisions can be taken well or not so well. But what strikes the outsider is it's a very one-directional thing, the firm to the government. And I think the story is, in many other countries which have had some success, oh, I don't want that, do I, is that we need to get employers more intimately involved. That's easily said and has been tried in the UK on many occasions with varied degrees of success, because employers can be awkward beasts, not least in our country. Their commitment to work-based training across the UK as a whole, for example, has been entirely pathetic. And as you know, the volume of work-based training has actually fallen in recent years. So that's not a good starting point. To get employers to act collectively can also be difficult, but not impossible. Many employers, the third bullet point there, may be perfectly good and sensible in doing what's good for them, but it would be the low route. And that may not be what Wales wants. So what we're saying here, I think, is that at least it's worth thinking rather more than to the outsider as apparent from the documents about whether there's a more systematic way of getting employers, and for that matter, other interest groups, but in my view, dominantly employers, more involved in the process of thinking about what should be supported and what shouldn't be supported. It's highly dangerous, but it might just work. There are some other problems there. Experiences I've had with formalizing such arrangements is you don't necessarily get the right employers. It could, if you're not careful, just be a cabal for the current interest groups keeping the outsiders out. It could be that with the firms that you want, the hierarchy at the firms don't send the senior people, they send junior people. Or even worse, they send a senior person who's incredibly dangerous and they're worried will do damage to the company. So get him to Whitehall and then he could do damage to the sector council or whatever. But at least he's way away from the company where he can do real harm to the bottom line. So there are great dangers, and in particular, employers can whinge unnecessarily. I've seen case after case, mainly in England, about employers whinging about skill shortages and governments often reacting with money put into a particular training program or a particular education program. And if you actually look carefully, it's not a skill shortage at all. There are plenty of people around with those skills. They've just got lousy recruitment, terrible HR policies, or what have you. And at the same time, we know that more employers in Britain as a whole, as compared to employers in other OECD countries, underutilized skill, particularly at the top end. So the picture with employers is not necessarily very pretty. But if you really want to integrate the education and training system with an industrial strategy, then it seems to us you at least ought to think about more formal and systematic involvement of the employer. It might not work, but I don't think that you'll get that integration and you'll get that long-term thinking about how skills fit in to the economy in the medium and long term without at least trying that. About the education and training system in particular, the really important thing, as is evident really from what we've been saying already, is to distinguish between current needs of the economy and of the people involved in being educated and trained, and future needs. Again, this gets back to this more coordinated semi-planning. I'm not going to say much about early years or secondary schools, largely because I'm almost unrivaled in the depth of my ignorance about that particular sector. However, and Geraint is going to talk very specifically about that sector in a moment or two. However, I'll just make one comment. Again, I read very carefully a couple of the education documents, and much seemed to have been made of the OECD's visit not so long ago, and the recommendations that they made, which were repeated in a couple of the official documents I saw. And this was how to improve, essentially, school performance. The word that immediately came to mind was flaccid. All the right words were there, but they didn't really mean very much. And specifically, there was no specific suggestion that as to what research base there might be for thinking carefully about improving school achievement. They do say there's lots of research about how to do it, and the Welsh Government should follow that research. Well, having my research centre in the Department of Education, I've seen this research now for 20 years without a great deal of evidence of it improving school performance in England. So I'd be fascinated to know if there's something deep in the depths of the files of the Welsh Government which has some new research evidence which is going to make a breakthrough there. The other thing I'd say, very, very briefly, is this is where we start to see big differences between countries once you're getting to the later secondary stage. England in particular has had an academic stream and literally nothing else. Work-based training has taken the role of vocational training. What little we had of that for young people was, of course, severely prejudiced when the apprenticeship system, for a whole variety of reasons, declined massively through the 80s and onwards. And anyhow, that was only an elite system. There have been attempts to revive or to introduce a vocational stream several times. In a sense, the secondary modern schools are all about that. In a sense, the GNVQs are all about that. Currently, we have T-levels. I urge you to read the Whitehall documents on T-levels and groan with despair if they think that that is going to introduce a sensible vocational stream. Unsurprisingly, countries like the Netherlands, which have vocational schools starting at 14, and Austria and some other countries, this leads also to a more varied offering when it comes to, let's call it post-compulsory or tertiary education. As with other countries, countries like the Netherlands and Austria have seen a significant expansion in higher education provision, but not to the exclusion of alternative routes, be they different sorts of educational establishments offering qualifications below what is conventionally thought of as degree level, or be it work-based training routes. The Austrians have a mixture of the two, for example. And the thing I would urge any government to think about, easy to say, hard to do, is to think carefully about alternative pathways from the world of education into the world of work. The problem in England is obvious, that not only has the higher education system expanded massively, it's expanded in some senses at the expense of alternative pathways, the impoverished further education colleges, and of course work-based training. This, in my view, is in danger of leading to too much reliance on a conventional bachelor's degree. And what I'd be looking for in the medium term, if I had any power, was a government which was courageous enough to think harder about a mix of the different levels of qualification which are needed, as well as the types of qualification, mix of BAs and lower qualifications, and thinking harder than perhaps is often done about the location of learning. How much should be in universities? What should the universities be offering in terms of levels? How much should be in the further education colleges? I saw some very encouraging words about the further education sector in Wales, but certainly that's where I would be looking more carefully. I'd also be looking at how long these courses should last. I have a suspicion that much of what we've got at the moment in England is taking what were once 1.5-year courses and making them 3-year courses, so you call them a bachelor's. And everything has a cost, and that is not terribly cost effective. And finally, adults. If we're in this dramatically changing world, as clearly we are, then one needs to see more about adult training and retraining. Very briefly, just to summarize, what we're suggesting is, do we need stakeholders more involved in the planning process, for want of a better word, workforce planning process in Wales? Do we need more coordination? We need to remember that we don't just have market failure in this world, we also have systems failure. And if you start from a system what Feingold and Sofskis once called the low skills, low quality equilibrium, low quality work, low quality products, hard to break out of that, then face up to it. That should be something which needs to be tackled. And I think it is in every country still in the UK. But you also have administrative failure. That is the failure of governments to deliver adequately. A nasty, nasty problem. And the real problem, it seems to me, for potential industrial strategy and for potential administrative failure is, can an industrial strategy, if it involves preferencing some companies and some sectors above others, as appears to be the case in the world strategy, how good is it at picking the winners as opposed to the losers? And the $64,000 question. In the end, we can improve the quality of work even in quite low-level work. We can improve the quality of jobs. But frankly, there are limits. It depends on what people produce, what producers produce, and the design of those jobs, and that depends upon the quality of production in the end. Otherwise, there's still going to be a lot of dispossessed people. And that's the only way you're going to get equitable growth, to increase the quality of production. My apologies if I've done a Paul Krugman, but I will stop there.